Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 29th, 2019, and I'm your host, Cara Santa Maria. This week, we have a great show. We're going to be talking to the science writer, Christie Aschwanden. But before we do, I want to thank those of you who made Talk Nerdy possible, and that includes my top tier patrons at patreon.com/talknerdy. It's a great way for you to pledge your support of the show, or the support. I think they're both correct, because that's kind of the biggest driving force of the show. Remember, Talk Nerdy is and will always be 100% free to download. And that's because the show heavily relies on contributions from people just like you. And this week they include Pedro M. Rosario Barbosa, Phil T-Bear, The Zombie Drummer, David J.E. Smith, Jeffrey Perez, Gabriel Felipe Jaramillo Gonzalez, Brian Holden, and Jeffrey Sewell. Thank you guys so very much. If you want to hear your name at the top of the show, just go to patreon.com/talknerdy and you could read all about it right there. You could also visit talknerdymerch.com if you want to rock some cool, what do you think? Talk Nerdy merch? Yeah? Or you can just tell your friends and your family about the show, rate and review it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you download your podcasts. All right, guys, this is a really fun episode. I got to finally do an in-person recording, which I love to do, with Christie Aschwanden. Now, she's the author of Good to Go, What the Athlete in All of Us Can Learn from the Strange Science of Recovery. She's also the co-host of Emerging Form, which is a podcast about the creative process. And you've probably read some of her work. She was the former lead science writer at 538. She was a health columnist at the Washington Post, and she's a frequent contributor to the New York Times. You might have read some of her stuff in Runner's World or even Bicycling, because, of course, she herself is an athlete and she's written a lot about sports science in the past. So, we're really going to focus our conversation today on her new book, Good to Go. So without any further ado, here she is, Christie Aschwanden. Well, Christie, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So I'm happy that we're doing this in studio. It's gotten to be pretty rare with everybody's crazy schedules lately. And the fact that, the magic of the internet allows me to interview people from across the world. And you're not local.
I'm not. I'm down here in LA for a book signing tonight. I'm doing it at Vroman's Books. I was just came from a National Academies meeting about misinformation, science misinformation, which is a timely topic, let's just say.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And did you come just for that? Like, did you just get in yesterday, or have you been here for
I got in a few days ago.
Okay,
yeah.
good.
So it was a 2-day conference. I spoke yesterday, and tonight I'm doing book reading. I was just on Science Friday earlier this afternoon.
How cool is that?
Yeah, it's fun. So I've been doing the little tour. I went over to NPR West, which was kind of fun.
So obviously, before this book, you were, would you say, was your title lead science?
Lead science writer.
Science writer. Okay.
I was also an editor there. I edited our freelance work too.
Yeah. At 538. And so you probably, have been interviewed and have had those kinds of conversations, but is it a whole new ballgame?
Oh my God, it's not. It's like, I've been, throughout my career, I've been interviewed regularly on media, but it's different, having one every few months or something versus, the first week after my book launched, it was like, I had some days where there were 5 or 6 interviews. Yeah. So it was a lot. I actually started to lose my voice from all the talking, which had never happened to me before. I was like, I understand that these are good problems, but they are problems nonetheless.
Yeah. It's hard to do an interview with no voice, for sure.
Yeah.
So it's such an interesting topic first of all, it's such a necessary topic. It's fundamentally interesting to me, but for different reasons than people might expect, because I don't really care about sports.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not really that interested in sports. And I do feel like, especially coming from the skeptic side of things, I already have a bit of a, incredulous bent about a lot of sports science as it is. So it speaks to me at that level. But also, I actually really give a shit about nutrition and wellness and healthy eating, but also working out. And I go to a trainer and I'm on a calorie restricted diet right now. And I try to be as evidence-based as possible. And it's really hard because there's just so much confusing information out there.
Well, and I can tell you part of the reason it's so hard when it comes to diet is that, I mean, I wrote a story for 538. The headline was something like, you can't trust what you read about nutrition. And one of the reasons it's so hard is we don't have a lot of really high quality evidence on diet and nutrition. And so at the same time, we have these very strong beliefs that, what we eat must be really important to our health. And it's, that's not under dispute. Like, it is important, your diet, but we don't actually know. We don't have good evidence on the sort of granular level that we want to know. Like, should I eat this food or that food? In sort of grand terms and general principles and guidelines, we know that fruits and vegetables and foods with fiber, things like that, are healthier than very refined foods. But people really want to know that they can eat this one thing that's going to make everything better. And we just really don't have evidence of that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of pseudoscience. There's a lot of belief. And I tend to almost think of nutrition and sort of diets as almost a religion at this point.
Yeah.
Because people feel so passionate about it. They have such strong beliefs. And there's just so little strong evidence and science underlying those beliefs. And I think part of the reason here is that this is something that's very personal to people. So everyone has personal experience with diet and nutrition. We have what we eat and we know how we feel. And so everyone sort of feels like an expert.
Yeah, we all have anecdotal evidence.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, and it's really, that anecdotal evidence can be so compelling. It doesn't mean that it's right, but we're so compelled by it.
And I think that a lot of people who work in allied fields around diet, exercise, those kinds of things, your trainers and your nutritionists, and I put that in air quotes because that's very different from a dietitian, and people who really do make a living in the wellness world, who ultimately, fundamentally, I hope, are trying to do right by people and really are trying to ensure that people are happier and healthier. Obviously, there's a profit motive there, but even beyond that, there's so much like cultish belief, where a good example is that I was at the gym the other day with my trainer, who I absolutely love and I think is really talented at what he does. And we were talking about food, and I was saying how much I love Greek yogurt, and I eat Greek yogurt every day.
Delicious.
And he was like, and he's like, that's great. It's really good for you, blah, blah, but make sure you're not getting non-fat. And I'm like, why? I always eat non-fat Greek yogurt. And he's like, they put so many chemicals in it. And I'm like, we're not having this conversation. Like, you know what a chemical is, right? Like everything's a chemical. And it's one of those things where I do feel like from a psychological perspective, people who are trying to improve their health and their fitness fall into this trap where no matter what decision they make, they feel guilty about it because there's you're eating that thing, but it's not quite right. Yeah. Oh, you've cut down on carbs, but you're eating the wrong kinds of carbs. And but don't eat the packaged version. But there's always this, not all of us can like farm our own foods and then eat whole, fruits and vegetables every night. And it's such a hard thing.
All of this is particularly true in the sports recovery world, the things that I was investigating for this book. So much of it trades on this anxiety that people have, that they're missing out or that they're doing things just a little bit wrong. That there's a way that's just a little bit different. And we sort of have been taught that there's this idealized version of ourselves that's just out there waiting for us to attain it. And it's just like one weird trick away. And we have all these people lined up to teach us that one trick. But what I found in sports recovery, and I think that this is true with nutrition too, is that there aren't magic bullets, and it's really all about the basics. And it's been really interesting to me. I have to admit this was a little bit unexpected, but one of the most common reactions I've been getting from readers who've read the book now is like this, I'll get letters that say, thank you so much. I can just relax. I was so anxious about this stuff. Thank you for giving me permission to stop worrying about some of this stuff and to not, have to do these things that I was doing sort of out of fear or out of anxiety or out of a sense
expensive.
Right.
And take up so much time.
Yeah, we're really at a moment where recovery has become its own source of stress, which is just, it's exactly the opposite of what it should be.
Yeah, it's so funny. Like, I feel like this is a very lucky coincidence that we're having this chat today, because I have been suffering from super severe back pain for weeks, and I don't know what caused it. It seems to be that I have a really tight T-band and my posterior chain is really tight. And like I'm lifting weights and things like that, everything's just crunched and horrible. And one of the things that my trainer has been doing each week when I go into the gym is instead of foam rolling, which we're going to talk about, it's like one step further, which is using this like machine called a hypervolt.
Oh, wow.
Which is like a
like one of those drills.
Those deep vibration machines. And I'm telling you, it loosens things up and decreases pain so much that this is probably the most non-skeptical thing I've ever done. But I went out and dropped like legit money on one of them. And now I'm like, did I make the right decision? Am I being stupid? How much of this is about actually improving health and how much of it is about reducing pain and how much of it is, all these things start to mix together. So I would love to talk first and foremost, before we get into the science of how we know this stuff, about maybe a basic difference between when it comes to sports recovery. Mm-hmm. One thing, let's say if you actually break a bone.
Right.
Or you have a demonstrable ligament injury. Yeah.
So I just want to be really clear. So the book, there's so much stuff here. I had to sort of make some decisions, and a lot of them were like, how can I like make sure that I don't need a whole decade to research this stuff because there's so much. But anyway, one of the decisions I made is that it does not cover sports injuries. So recovery from injury, and that is a discrete and different thing. And so this is really about recovery from one workout to the other. You do a marathon, like how do you come back? And because the next day you're going to feel really tired, things like that. So it's really, the book is really focused on that, not the sports injury.
Not the thing where, you're training, you're working out, you're doing a sport, and something happens and you need to see a doctor.
Right.
The harder thing is when people are like, I feel not amazing. I'm sore. Am I more sore than I should be? Is this a normal amount of soreness? Am I swollen? Do I need to take NSAIDs? Do I need to roll out my muscles? Should I get in an ice bath? Do I go for cupping or massage or rolfing or yoga? And it's sort of that, maybe I would say, first of all, I'm not a doctor. But probably if you're concerned that something is legitimately wrong, go to a doctor, right? That's like the number one. Go see a professional if something feels wrong.
I'm no professional. I'm not giving medical advice. Correct.
So beyond that, if you feel like it doesn't necessitate going to a doctor, you're just getting a little older, things are not kind of going back into place, like you said, after you ran that marathon, or even after you took a lap around the block and your knee was a little creaky or you're feeling a little swollen, there's a whole industry.
Oh, yeah.
That's cropped up around this.
There absolutely is. Yeah. And it's really, like I said, so much of this really focuses on this anxiety that we have. So it's like, my body's giving me these signals. I'm tired or I'm sore and I don't know what to do about it. And what does that mean? And so, you have these products and these people popping up to tell you, oh, we have the magic solution. Here's what you can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so what are some good examples of the things that people are probably bombarded with in terms of maybe advertisements on Instagram if they follow a lot of nutritional or fitness accounts, or maybe when they go to the gym, the things that their trainers are pushing on them. Definitely, I think alkaline water is one that I hear about a lot.
Yeah.
Services, whether it be everything from a traditional, normal kind of massage all the way to what kind of things do we hear about people doing?
All sorts of things. Rolfing, like there's a whole slew of varieties of massage that can be done and things like that.
And acupuncture, it's a big one. Chiropractic, cupping. And then there's like the supplements.
Oh, yeah. I have a whole chapter on supplements. And I guess if I were just to summarize it in a sentence, it would be don't.
Like what's the usual like expensive pee or something? But actually it can cause real injury, right?
Yeah, it's not just worthless. In many cases, it can be harmful. And in the book, I talk about numerous athletes who have tested positive for banned substances that they ingested through a tainted supplement. And this is common enough, and these aren't just the there's certain supplements that you can look at. So one of the ones that was, I believe it was sort of recalled, was called Jacked, like what was it? JAK. But you can some of these you're like, okay, that looks a little dicey.
It's got like 3 X's
right,
in the
and
middle.
It's like and like okay, if it's like a male enhancement pill, like maybe that could be a little dicey. But there are a couple of athletes who tested positive after taking multivitamins. I talk about 2 triathletes who tested positive from electrolyte tablets. So it really...
So they had like hormones in them? Or?
Yeah, they had these sort of designer, and these are just traces. It wasn't, I don't think that these were things where the companies were intentionally putting them in to try and make, that does happen. I mean, supplements, we could talk all day about
because like I took that one brand and I felt much better.
Yeah.
It's like, because they loaded it with caffeine or testosterone or some sort of.
Right, and there are numerous, I mean, very regularly the FDA puts out alerts where there are supplements that are found to contain often bans pharmaceuticals, hormones, things that are not supposed to be in there. So that does happen. And in some of those cases, it's probably intentional. Can't say that for sure. But even if you're taking, there's this idea that, well, you can take a good brand or you can know. But I mean, I talk about there are multiple athletes who are taking supplements from their sponsors. These were companies that were sponsoring them. And, you would think doing this in good faith. So I think it's really difficult to really be sure. And we just don't have good evidence that any of this stuff helps. So it's really a risk not worth taking.
And it seems like, especially in the more like nutrition, kind of the broed out, like get jacked. Like there's a place down the street from my gym called like get shredded or get jacked. It's like GNC on steroids. Yeah. Like those kinds of nutritional supplements too are like, what's your, recommended daily allowance? We give you 9,000% of that. And it's like at a certain point, isn't that too much?
Right.
And oftentimes we find out, it is.
Yeah, it probably is.
Probably don't take 9,000% of your daily allowance of vitamin, XYZ.
Yeah. And this goes back to this anxiety that like, well, we're not doing it quite right. And there's really this idea that, we're probably not eating quite right. And people get very anxious about their diets. And I understand that. But I think it really feeds off of that anxiety. And so there's a notion that, well, we could make up for it with vitamins. In fact, driving over here, I saw a billboard for some, it looked like designer vitamins or something. And I can't remember the exact name now, but it was something about like smart pills or something. But the idea was that this is a smart way to take care of yourself when in fact, that's nonsense.
Oh yeah, it like gives people a sense of efficacy, I think, when there's like a whole new movement where they're customized. Yeah. So you go online and it's got your name printed on the package. And instead of one multivitamin, there's like 7. So you know you're really taking the good stuff. And it is hard. I mean, I recently did have on the show, if you guys are interested in more on like the intense kind of regulatory aspects and stuff of vitamins, Sonia Pemberton, who did a really great documentary called Vitamania, which is all about the vitamin craze.
Oh yeah. In fact, there's a terrific book also called Vitamania. And I believe that film was based probably on it. Yeah. It's by a wonderful writer, Catherine Price. It's a terrific book, but it's also a really terrific look at 2 things that I think are very interesting. One is sort of how did we come to understand like what vitamins are and how they exist, that they exist, which when you think about it is kind of amazing that we could figure this out, right? Because they really are sort of magic chemicals, right? Or magic substances. But then the other thing that the book really does well is sort of go over this regulatory climate and how did we get to this point where it's so, there's just so little oversight, but there's such fierce defense of these products and how, sort of like how did we teach America to fall in love with these placebo pills?
Yeah, and then there's such a strong industry and such a strong lobby protecting it now. Yeah. So it's kind of like a hands-off situation.
That's actually something that I found throughout this whole, let's call it the recovery industrial complex, is that there's so much money, but also there are sort of vested interests. So not just companies that are paying money to produce studies and to show that their products work, but you also have sort of people that are presenting themselves as experts and that are doing this, and you have a lot of coaches. And so they sort of have these beliefs or these practices and things. And so it becomes sort of self-perpetuating and, people believe it. And you have many cases too. I mean, supplements is a good example of this. A lot of gyms make a lot of money selling these. A lot of trainers make a lot of money from these things. So, if you're going to someone, a personal trainer is selling you supplements, you may want to think twice about why they're recommending these,
what's their, what are they getting?
I mean, it's a great business plan. It's probably not great science.
No, and that's, and I know that probably what I'm about to say is going to sound a little bit elitist, and I hope that it really fundamentally comes down to a more critical thinking approach. But it's one of those frustrating things where, for example, like a registered licensed dietitian has gone through an accredited academic program to develop the necessary skills to offer a certain, a certain level of expertise. Mm-hmm. A medical doctor has gone through, and that doesn't mean there aren't bad versions of those people. Right. But when you have somebody who like calls themselves a nutritionist, where it's not that it means that they got some sort of certification online, but it also doesn't mean that, because there's no body governing this. And it's, there's a reason that there are things like licenses and accreditation boards, because you have to be able to know as a consumer and be protected against predatory, action. And so I hate to say, oh, but that person went to school for longer, because that's not always what it's about. But they did go through enough hoops to show that they know what the fuck they're talking about.
That's right. At the same time, though, I think it's worth pointing out that most doctors don't have much. I mean, most doctors have very little training in nutrition and things like this. If you go to your doctor asking about some of these sports recovery techniques and products, there's a good chance that the doctor just doesn't know much more than you, not because they haven't been trained, but that's not this kind of stuff that they really cover in medical school. Well, and it's difficult. And like I was saying earlier, particularly with nutrition, the state of the evidence is pretty poor. That doesn't mean that the scientists are bad. It's just a really difficult problem. And so you have this tendency to sort of oversell and overpromise and sort of explain things with the kind of certainty that we just don't have from the data.
Yeah, I was at the doctor just last week getting a typical physical, and all the things I needed to bring up because I hadn't seen a doctor in a year, the visual migraines I deal with, my back pain, some other things. And also I did one of these impedance machine tests to figure out my body fat versus and they're apparently, from everything I've read, they're reliable, but not necessarily valid. So if you use the same machine time to time, you can track progress, but it's not necessarily going to give you an absolute score that's, number one most predictive, autopsy. Don't want to go through that. Number two, the floaty tanks, those seem to be better. And then these impedance machines. And mine came back that I'm 36% body fat. And I was like, I know, like, that's like obese.
I'm looking at you right now. That's belies what I see.
And I was really, I was like having an existential crisis because I've been working really hard. And I recently, for 10 weeks, been doing calorie restriction. I've lost 8 pounds. Wow. And so I was like really proud of myself. And then I'm 36% body fat, which is well into, although my BMI is right in the middle. And I'm really confused by this. And so and my trainer's doubling down, like, no, we need to work on this. And so I'm talking to my doctor and he's like, first of all, you're not 36. But then he's like, I don't know how to, like, I could write you a referral to go to a place where you could get these measurements, but they're not going to, your insurance might not cover it. Yeah. They may not really prioritize you because these are obesity clinics where they're working with people with type 2 diabetes who are in dire need. And you're like, oh, I just want to be a little more fit.
So this gets to a really good point that I talk about in the book, which is, I think it can be really dangerous and misleading when we start looking at numbers and we start measuring things just sort of willy-nilly without
context.
Yes, without context. But also when you go to a doctor and you're getting some sort of medical test, you should never get a test just to get a test. It should have some sort of objective. You need to know, why are we doing this test? What will it tell us? And what might I do differently based on the results? And if there isn't something that's going to change based on the results, you probably don't need the test to begin with. There's a lot of other questions you should probably ask, but statistics show that doctors are very bad at understanding and being able to answer them. But things like, how good is this test? What is the specificity? If I come back positive, what are the chances I actually have that disease or that problem? That's a whole nother realm we don't need to get into right now. But my point is that it's really easy to start measuring the wrong things and paying attention to the wrong things. And so I'll give you an example. I talk in the book about this thing called orthosomnia. And this is something that happens when people...
bone sleep?
No. It's basically what happens when people become so anxious about tracking their sleep that it becomes this feedback mechanism. And
then they can't sleep.
Yes, their concern about sleep and tracking the sleep becomes its own source of problems and basically prevents them from sleeping well. And in the book, I have this story about I think it was a woman who went into a sleep lab. She was really concerned because her wrist tracker was telling her that she was sleeping very poorly, even though she was in bed the right number of hours, that kept telling her that her sleep quality was very poor.
Even though she probably was feeling okay during the day.
Well, she's not feeling okay because she's really anxious because she's seeing these numbers and it's creating this feedback anxiety loop, right?
Yeah.
So she goes and they're like, you're sleeping great. You're a great sleeper. And she sort of refused to believe it because the numbers were telling her one thing.
Because her Fitbit was apparently more accurate than a scientific sleep study.
Right. And I think this is an important point, is that, this technology can actually have a really terrible downside, which is it sort of gets us away from being able to pay attention to our bodies, to read our bodies. So you were saying earlier, I did a workout, now I'm sore. What does that mean? You actually need to figure out for yourself what that means. You need to do some trial and error. You need to sort of have those experiences, pay attention and sort of, maybe try things and see how they work or whatever. But we have this idea that we're going to get a watch that will give a number that will tell us what to do, or an expert's going to tell us what to do. But so much of this is just stuff that we need to pay attention to our bodies and learn to read our bodies. And I sort of make the case in the book that the most important skill that any athlete can develop is an ability to read their bodies, because our bodies tell us what we need to know. We just need to pay attention. And I think one of the sort of worst parts of this whole recovery industrial complex is that it's really taking us away from that. And it's telling us you can't trust what you're feeling. I have a whole chapter about hydration and how that became this thing that, we sort of made it so much more complicated than it needs to be. And so we've been taught now that we cannot trust our thirst, that if you wait until you're thirsty, it's too late, which is complete nonsense. It's not scientific. We actually have people literally dying from drinking too much water because they've been told that they need to drink early and often, and they need to drink according to some schedule. I mean, our bodies are really resilient. And I think that's one thing people need to understand. That we're not, in this really delicate balance where if you get something just a tiny bit wrong, everything's going to go to hell. Our bodies are really capable of being able to sort of make do with the conditions that we place them under. And so you sort of start worrying about and paying attention to the wrong things. And then what happens is people neglect the basics. So, they're taking the supplements, or they're doing, the fancy equipment and all that, but they're sleeping 5 hours a night.
Yeah, or they don't notice that they have kidney pain because, whatever is happening. Yeah, it is really interesting because I think often we forget, a lot of people don't have a lot of basic biology background. And so you hear the funny stories, or you hear, about people not knowing what certain organs do, or thinking that they can drink something and it'll replace a bodily fluid, or, these funny things. And obviously you can understand these things at a very high level, a very complicated level, but even having a basic grasp of the difference between your kidneys and your liver and your pancreas, I think is important, because if you know anything about buffers, about the fact that our body, we're mammals, right? And we're very different than lizards, for example. We can adjust to fluctuating temperatures, and we can, and there's all these great systems inside that help maintain a homeostasis, and we have to be pretty sick.
That's right.
To get outside of those things. And you're right, that is important to remember, because basically what we're trading now is a concern about a health issue for a real, potentially devastating psychological issue.
That's right.
And this can be at the root, sometimes we see people with anorexia. We often think of this as an eating disorder, but sometimes it's a
psychological disorder, actually.
Yeah, and sometimes it has nothing to do with food, and it has to do with over-exercising. It has to do with, being overly rigid about controlling those things. It's interesting, too, that the idea of these sports trackers and these different smart machines, because I think that they just feed into a more global kind of zeitgeist phenomenon that we're so distracted from ourselves. And so when you talk about listening to your body, it just reminds me that it's basically the same core of, the therapeutic work that I've been doing lately, which is it's all about mindfulness.
It really is. In fact, I have a whole chapter in the book about mindfulness and the psychological aspect of recovery, which is fundamental to good recovery, but it's something that's so often neglected and people just dismiss it. But, your body, stress is stress, whether it's coming from exercise or it's coming from the stress in your life. And so you're never going to have optimal recovery if you are not addressing the other stresses in your life. And that's just such an important thing. And one of the bits of advice that I do give is that it's a really good idea to come up with some and I think they do need to be daily, but daily rituals for unwinding and for letting go of stress and having some time in your day where you're not thinking about work, you're not doing stressful things, you're not, getting caught up in that sort of psychological stress that can be so pervasive in our lives these days.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely have noticed a massive change in my own personal life. Being a PhD student at 35, I am better at it now than I would have been if I had gone straight through and done it at 23, most of my peers. And it's because I have built sleep hygiene, rituals like bullet, or not, I don't quite bullet journal, but something similar to bullet journaling, having certain lists and plans, but also building in time for myself to watch my favorite television show or to meditate every night. These are things that I just didn't know I needed when I was younger, but they're hugely helpful.
Yeah, they really are.
Hugely helpful. And I do wonder how much, because it's interesting that you focus in the book on the recovery process, because a lot of authors have written about the actual performance process.
Right.
But some of the same things go into this, being psychologically healthy in a way is just as important as being quote unquote physically healthy. There is no one without the other, is there?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
And so it's funny because coming back to this anxiety around doing the right thing, the choices that we often make in terms of feeling better. So let's say our body is giving us these signals and we have learned to listen to our body and we're like, oof, not doing great lately. I'm working out a lot. I'm eating well. I'm sleeping every night, but I'm in pain. Or this, I think my hips are not doing, they're not aligned the way they should be, or I haven't been stretching enough, or whatever the case is. So there's all these massage things and these cupping things and whatever. Is the evidence when it comes to any of these, let's say not products, but services, is there any good evidence out there?
I think the answer to your question depends on what do you mean? Like, what is the evidence you're looking for? What is the problem you're trying to address? Are you trying to aid recovery? If you're trying to aid recovery, then I think the answer to that question is it helping you relax? Is it helping you, at its most fundamental level, recovery is just rest and relaxation. I mean, it really is that simple. And
you can't really accelerate it, can you?
No. So that is exactly where I'm going with this. What I learned and what I sort of ultimately concluded is that a lot of these things are just sort of rituals and things to do to make us feel proactive, because a lot of people really want to feel like they're doing something and they can't handle not doing anything. You could just put your feet up, lie down on the couch, read a book, but a lot of people don't want to do that. They need to feel like they're doing something. And so many of these things are really just a thing to do while you're waiting. While you're waiting for your body to do what it's going to do, because your body's going to recover. Some of these things may accelerate that a little bit. I'm not saying that nothing works at all and they don't have any benefits, but so much of the benefit is just sort of helping with that process. And the thing that's interesting is it's like we don't acknowledge that, and that's not good enough for us, because just saying, it helped me relax and it felt really good, that doesn't feel scientific. And for us in our culture right now, science trumps all this other stuff. And that's not a bad thing, except when you have these scientific claims that actually aren't backed up, but those are the things that are being used to sell so many of these things. And so they're really enticing. It's like, we can tell you that it's infrared radiation, which is heat, by the way. And so you can say, heat feels really nice, and feeling nice helps me relax, and that could legit help you recover better. But it's not because it's infrared radiation. There's nothing particularly special about that wavelength, despite what Tom Brady says. And he's got these $200 magic pajamas that are a bunch of, but hey, if you have the money and they feel comfortable to sleep in, I guess. Yeah,
the sad thing is the guilt and the shame that the viewers, the people who wish they could be Tom Brady, feel when they can't quite keep up, or they can't
I think it's
quite.
something different, actually. I think that people want to be like Tom.
Yeah.
Look, he was good. He was performing before he had any of these products that he's shilling now. These pajamas didn't exist when he won his first Super Bowl.
Yeah, that's
so the idea,
true.
but people just think, I mean, it's this illusion that, well, I'm going to be able to get a little bit closer to him. And if I do what he does, maybe I will come close to his greatness or his performance. And, I think we know that that's not true, but we still just have this little
I think
hope.
you're right. Yeah. All right, everyone. I want to take a quick break to thank the sponsors of this week's episode, starting with Calm. Now, you guys have heard me talk about Calm several times on the show before, and that's honestly because long before I partnered with them, I've been using Calm. Calm really helps me personally with all of my stress. It's a great meditation app, but it does so much more than teach you to meditate and help you through the process. The great thing about Calm is that you don't have to know what you're doing. And even if you're really scared, it's going to guide you through, because there are all sorts of different sessions, everywhere from heavily guided meditation to meditation with less guidance. And there are all sorts of different programs. There's the Daily Calm. There are sections on emotion series. There's sections on self-care. There are even meditations for while you're driving to work or while you're outside walking. And one of my favorite things about Calm is the music. There's an entire section of music, everything from focus music that really helps me when I'm reading and writing papers for school, all the way to sleep music, which I absolutely love. And guys, right now, if you head to calm.com/nerdy, you will get 25% off of a Calm premium subscription. Remember, that's calm.com/nerdy for 25% off of a Calm premium subscription. You'll get unlimited access to all of Calm's content today. One more time, that's calm.com/nerdy. I also want to thank Puppo for their support of the show. Puppo is so great. It makes pet parenting easier because it takes the guesswork out of choosing the right food for your dog. Whether your dog is large, small, whether your dog has a teeny tiny mouth or a really big mouth, or it's maybe a little bit more lazy or it's got a lot more energy. What Puppo does is it helps prepare personalized food blended specifically for your dog's lifestyle and for your dog's health. So you're going to enter in everything from size and age to wellness goals and even ingredient sensitivities. And the pet nutritionists at Puppo are going to put together a perfect dog food with perfect portions. And I'll tell you what, Killer eats it up like crazy. He absolutely loves the way it tastes, so much more than his store-bought dog food. And oh, the best part, I know it's silly, but I just love it. They print a picture of your dog on the bag. It's so cute. And like I said, it's perfectly portioned. Even the kibble is the right size for your dog's mouth. All sorts of things. Killer has a little bit of a sensitive stomach, a sensitive coat, and the dog food's developed for that, whether your dog has problems maintaining a healthy weight, or even they have flavor preferences, like do they love chicken and maybe hate lamb? They're going to help you out with that too. So right now, you guys can try Puppo for your dog. All you've got to do is go to puppo.com/nerdy. You'll get 14 days of personalized dog food delivered for only $9. So again, that's PUPPO.com/nerdy for 14 days of personalized dog food delivered for only $9. All right, guys, let's get back to the show. Question for me, though, when it comes to, so, we talk about recovery and, the need to not feel idle and the need to feel, because you were saying societally, it's this function of like, we need to be efficient all the time, right? We've got to always be doing something that's working towards a goal, because if we're not, then we're actually failing at living. Yeah.
And I guess I'm just kind of saying, like, slow it down, like chill out, like literally just chill. Like that's what you need to do. Like what's happened here is we've sort of made recovery into its own source of stress. It's an extension of the workout, not just in the sense that it's as important as the workout, which is completely true, but that we feel like we need to be trying and working just as hard at it. And that just leads to a situation where you never have any downtime. You're just always on, you're always doing things and never just sort of letting go and letting your body do what it needs to do.
And you're actually exacerbating the problem.
Right, absolutely.
Because your cortisol is never, ever being reduced.
That's right. Yeah.
But the interesting thing, I mean, For me, as somebody, I'm coming at this from a sort of narcissistic perspective because I'm like, but I right now am dealing with, but I also hope that what I'm doing is I'm being a proxy for a lot of people listening who are like, yeah. Okay, relax in between, take some time, be mindful, let my body heal. But also, what if I'm in pain? Yeah. And that's really another layer to this, which is it's one thing to relax because I'm tired after a workout, but maybe now I'm kind of in pain after that workout. And I don't think that this is to the extent that I have an injury, but it's bad enough that I feel like I need to do something because I'm not comfortable sitting around relaxing. I want to feel better right now. So that's a whole other kind of angle to sports recovery.
Absolutely. And I think that you raise a really good point. And that is, it can be painful. And if you're working out really hard, you get sore and really tired, and that can be really uncomfortable. And I think that that's where a lot of these things, these rituals, products, services can actually be helpful if they make you feel better. So for instance, I think massage is great. Did I find like a lot of good hard evidence that it's actually expediting recovery? No, but what I did find is that athletes love it. I love it. It feels really good. And so it may or may not make me feel less sore in the long run faster, but it makes me feel a lot better in the short term. And I know that while I'm there on the table, I'm not thinking about all the stresses in my life. I'm actually lying down, like literally relaxing. So that's good. So I think that, it's interesting because here I am, this total science nerd. I'm a data hound. I'm a data journalist. And so it may seem a little bit weird that I'm saying, stop fixating so much on the data. But I think that this is really a situation. And I guess I was a little surprised to learn this, but just that some of this qualitative stuff and the qualitative data and the qualitative evidence, so the qualitative evidence of like, is it making you feel better, is like, in some cases, much more important than this quantitative stuff where you might measure something on a watch or in some sort of test or something like that. Because really at its basic level, that's what you need to be doing.
You're so speaking my language right now because like I am having this awakening in my program working towards, I'm at the end of my second year, so I'm starting to develop my dissertation. And I've opted now to do a qualitative dissertation, which back when I was a hard scientist, neuroscientist, I didn't know existed until I got into the social sciences. And at first I was really poo-pooing it. And now I'm realizing that for the research questions I want to ask, it's a much more necessary, realistic approach. And also just coming into social sciences more, I'm understanding that the medical model as it applies to pharmacology or as it applies to surgery does not apply to psychotherapy, and it may not apply to sports recovery. So this concept of placebo, which we often talk about, which really ultimately is not a fake thing. It's basically just non-specific effects, right? It's the stuff that we're not actually hypothesizing. Right. That's what a placebo effect is. So it could be just being at the doctor's office gives me a psychological improvement. Seeing a physician helps me be more mindful of taking my medication at home, so I actually have a benefit. But things like massage or muscle rolling, if I feel better after doing it, whether it's a placebo or not, it doesn't mean it didn't work. It means it might be acting on something different, like my ability to be more mindful.
Yeah. So I have a whole chapter in the book about placebos. And I really come down thinking that they're good, actually, in some way. I'm not, so I'm sort of like pro placebo in the sense that they can be helpful. Placebo effects are real effects. They're not, we tend to be dismissive of them because it's like, oh, that's not some physiological thing, or it's not the drug working or the thing. But what it's doing is we're sort of harnessing our own powers to make us feel better. And that's what we really care about. So if we care about feeling better, how that happened is probably a little bit less important. But what's really happening here, I interviewed a guy who I quote in this chapter, who likes to call, instead of calling it the placebo effect, he likes to call it the expectation effect. And I really like that because I think that particularly in the context of sports recovery things, that's really what's going on. Your expectation of an experience can drastically affect how you actually experience that thing. And so if you do something and you expect it to make you feel less sore the next day, you may actually interpret the soreness that you feel that next day to be less severe. It may seem, like you're able to handle it more. You may actually feel better, not because anything has physiologically changed, but because your expectation of it has changed. And that's okay.
Yeah. And I mean, it's how psychotherapy works, really. Like when you say it's a placebo effect, I think that minimizes what it is. Yeah. And I also think I like the idea of changing the name away, because I think it's a misnomer to call it a placebo effect. If we really get down to the term, the original use of the word placebo, a placebo is a group in a randomized controlled trial that, like, the placebo is actually the form of the drug that does not have the active ingredient. Yeah. And so in that sense, I think it has a negative connotation. But the placebo effect is something very different. That's non-specific effects. It's not the thing you're measuring, but it doesn't mean there aren't all sorts of other things that are happening, right? And you're not going to improve from psychotherapy unless you want to. We all know this. We've seen it across the board. And it's the non-specific kind of active ingredients, like having a good relationship, like being empathic. Like, these are the things that are most predictive. And I think it's the same thing when it comes to pain. Like, when we look at the placebo effect as it applies to all sorts of different medical, biomedical, scientific studies.
Yeah, well, what's really interesting about the placebo effect is that it seems to be most powerful in things that have some sort of experiential component to it.
And that are more subjective, right?
More subjective.
Yeah.
So it's things like pain. It's things like, soreness is a kind of pain, but it's things like this. And I don't think that just means, it's all in your head, you're making it up. But we actually, our experience, pain is a neurological process, right? It's not just something that's happening, at the level of that muscle that's sore. And another thing that I learned looking at some of these modalities is that some of them may just sort of work on that whole neurological pathway and this experience of pain that we have. And so, it may be that our expectations of how it's working are different from how they're actually working. And foam rolling is a good example of that. The explanation that's usually given is that it's targeting the fascia, which is this tissue that sort of surrounds your muscles, sort of like saran wrap or something like that. And the idea, which is unproven, but it's a working hypothesis, is that there may be adhesions that can form between them. So almost like little crinkles between that, and that the foam rolling is sort of smoothing those out and helping to make that smooth and make that nice. It may be that that's what's happening. We don't have really good evidence of that yet, mostly because this is just sort of a new area of study. It's something that I think in a few more years, 5 more years, we'll know a lot more. Right now, it's just all sort of new. But there's some really interesting evidence that there's a strong neurological component. So if you do foam rolling on one leg, you actually get benefits on both legs.
Interesting.
And so you can say, well, it must be placebo, but it's also possible that it's working on some sort of neurological basis in the brain or in other ways. And so it may just be that it's working on these sort of pain pathways, which is really interesting.
Yeah, because it's like you take an NSAID, it's non-specific. It's going to reduce your pain globally. Yeah. It's not going to like go to the targeted pain source. That's not how they work. And so if you take something that's an anti-inflammatory, it's going to, do that across your body. If you take something that like even an opiate, it's literally just going to reduce your perception of pain.
Right.
So that's just as important.
Correct.
I always thought too that it was supposed to, is this like a total nonsense explanation, that it's supposed to help you kind of disperse the lactic acid that's been building up in your muscles?
Oh, lactic acid.
Is this a bullshit thing? Okay, tell me all about this.
When people start telling you it's doing something to lactic acid, you can just shut it down.
Love it.
Yeah.
It's like when they try to sell you alkaline water.
Exactly. I mean, it's lactic acid things are like the equivalent of alkaline water.
Nice.
We used to think lactic acid made you sore. It wasn't, it was a hypothesis. It wasn't unreasonable. It is associated with intense exercise. So it is there in your muscles.
And like an anaerobic action.
But it doesn't seem to cause soreness. So that idea has been overturned. That's what we do in science. You have one idea, you keep testing it, and you learn that it's not quite what you first thought, but it's something else. But it's also cleared quite rapidly from the muscles.
Oh, so, naturally.
Yeah. And so by the time you're getting around to doing one of these things, it's probably gone.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Okay. Gotcha. So the next day when you're like, it feels feel so much worse the next day.
Yeah.
That's not lactic acid.
No. Yeah, that's delayed onset muscle soreness. And that is
story of my life.
It's the worst, right?
It is the worst.
Yeah.
Okay, so not lactic acid, but foam rolling might be doing something to the fascia. It might be completely in our heads. But either way, it does seem, for the people for whom it works, it does seem to work.
Yeah.
So good to know.
Yeah. I mean, people ask me, should I do it? Is it bullshit? And, my answer is sort of like, we don't really know right now. At the moment, we don't have good evidence. We don't have very solid evidence that it's something, we don't have evidence on the level that I would say if you're not doing it, you need to start.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's some promising evidence. It may be that it really works. There are people that swear by it. It doesn't seem to be something that's harmful.
No, it just hurts like hell.
Right.
But it feels better after if it feels better after.
And my hypothesis with that is if you do something that's really painful, then that will make whatever original pain you had feel better by comparison.
True.
But yeah, if you're foam rolling and you're convinced it works and you're not spending stupid money on it and making it, if it's not too stressful, go ahead. But anyone who's not foam rolling or who doesn't want to or thinks it's too painful, there's not compelling evidence to say that you need to start.
Interesting.
But I'm not going to pull, these foam rollers out of people. I've had numerous people say, you will take my foam roller over my dead body, Well,
yeah, it's the same with, I shouldn't say it's the same because there's a lot of, I think there's evidentiary benefit to yoga, right? There are studies that show that people who actively engage in yoga on a regular basis have positive psychological benefits, at least from it. Or does it have any sort of protective mechanisms against injury, things like that?
There's not. So one of the problems, people have asked a lot about yoga, but one of the problems with yoga is there's so many, it's almost like you're saying strength training. Well, it's just such a catch-all phrase, and there are so many different
eating beneficial, usually.
And there are types of yoga that are really, really great for stress reduction. That's great. But then there are some that are extremely active and are almost workats in their own right. And so that's a different,
I don't do this.
Yeah. So it's really, it's almost a difficult question to answer because of that.
So, but going back real quick, before we get into, I think, something that's really important that we're going to close with.
Sure.
There were two things that we didn't mention yet. First, we were talking about how it's not lactic acid. I sort of lost my train of thought before, but now I remember what I wanted to ask. We were talking about how it's not lactic acid. It might be the fascia. This is how potentially foam rolling works. But the reason we foam roll is because we have this muscle soreness. And if our muscles aren't sore because of lactic acid, why are they sore? What causes muscle soreness, or do we really know?
So we don't know all the answers in terms of exactly what's, so we know this. When you're doing hard exercise, when you're doing the kind of exercise that makes you sore like that, you're causing little micro damage in the muscles. So you're causing these little tears and little bits of damage. And so your body has to go in and repair those. And that's actually what makes you stronger, because it's your body goes in and it doesn't just repair those muscles. It adds more protein and it adds more stuff.
So
makes them
fortified.
Stronger. It basically fortifies it. It's okay, we got hit with this exercise. We're going to fortify so that we're ready for the next time. And that's why, this is called the repeat bout effect, where, you've probably noticed this. The first time you go lift weights, you get really sore. You get less sore as time goes on.
And then you change up your exercise a little bit.
And then you're sore again.
Muscles are sore.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. All right. So that makes sense. And so that would make sense why an NSAID would be helpful if you're having a lot of inflammation, right? As part of the healing process.
NSAIDs are great for dealing with pain. And if you're in a lot of pain, they might be a worthwhile thing to do. They're also reducing inflammation, though, and inflammation is a really important part of this healing process.
So you don't want to actually, so this takes us to the ice bath thing,
yes.
Right? This is a similar situation.
So you're actually, by taking NSAIDs, you're actually delaying healing. And this has been shown in numerous studies with injuries as well. And I think this is, in the context of injuries, I think it's a little bit complicated because NSAIDs are really good painkillers. So it may be sometimes that you need I don't want to tell anyone that they should like suffer through horrible pain. Because,
and if your pain is so bad that you can't get out of bed, then you're not doing other things that aid in healing, like walking around.
But the problem here is there are a lot of athletes that sort of take it prophylactically, or they take it in expectation. I'm going to do some hard workouts, so I'm going to take this ahead of time to make me less sore. And there's actually not good evidence that it prevents soreness.
Well, and also it's not good for your intestines, right?
It's hard on your
or maybe it's your stomach. I don't know, but your GI tract.
It's hard on your GI tract. It reduces inflammation, which can actually be a bug, not a feature. And so, I think NSAIDs are really something that athletes should avoid unless they really have some pain that is, of the order that it really requires a drug. But I think it's worth talking to your doctor too. And they aren't drugs that you should be taking like on a regular basis in large doses, which a lot of people do, and it's not a good idea.
No. Yeah, that's why it's PRN, right? It's as needed. It shouldn't be regular. And it even says on the bottle of every single NSAID you come across, like, don't take it for longer than X number of days. Read the labels. Yeah, it's probably good too. This is like kind of there for a reason, and there are drug effects, like they can interact with other things. So we had mentioned that that's similar to this conversation about icing. Yeah. Because what a trend getting in an ice bath. You see it all the time, like these badass athletes getting in this giant ice bath after they've just done an intense workout. And I remember reading, single study, or maybe it was meta-analysis, I don't know, it was a few years ago, that like getting in an ice bath is actually going to do the same thing, right? Potentially delay healing. Yeah,
there's some pretty good evidence now, or pretty enticing evidence, I'll say, that icing can actually, can reduce your response to exercise, and it delays this healing. So you don't want to do it. There's one study that I talk about in the book where they put people on an exercise program, like a strength program, and then they iced one limb and not the other. And the limbs that had the icing actually had more fatigue, delayed recovery. They had reduced gains in muscle strength, which is really interesting, and also some reduced activation of some of the key proteins in muscles. So it's not just that it's not helpful, it may actually be a bad idea.
That's it. Yeah, because you think about sort of rationally, just, what do you call it? Like face validity. Yeah. You think about, what does ice do? It inhibits, right? It's like inhibiting certain processes from taking place, or it's making them happen more slowly.
Yeah, and that's basically, I think, a really good way of thinking about it. It's delaying your response to that exercise. It's delaying your healing. It's delaying the inflammation, the inflammatory process that's going to make you stronger and that's going to clear out that soreness.
And then I would think on the flip side, that would make people say, but then heat.
Right.
So if ice is bad, is a heating pad good?
Yeah. So I haven't found evidence that heat is like accelerating recovery. But what I can tell you is that heat feels really good. And this goes back to feeling good is really, whereas an ice bath does not feel good.
No.
And, there is the hypothesis that it's well established that painful placebos are more effective than painless ones. So there could be an effect there, which is interesting. But heat is pleasant. There's not compelling evidence that it speeds recovery necessarily, but it can definitely make you feel better. And it does, whereas as cold reduces blood flow, heat increases it. So that may be helpful, possibly. But again, this is sort of hypothesis.
But there's no compelling evidence on the flip side that heat is detrimental or dangerous.
No, I haven't seen any evidence that it's harmful.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. So,
and, I talk about infrared saunas are really popular now. And infrared saunas are basically saunas that are a little less warm than a normal sauna. But people swear by them. And, hey, saunas feel good if they help you relax. They can be really nice. There are some pretty outlandish claims that are made about them.
Yeah, you're not sweating out your toxins, people.
Right. Yeah, pretty much anytime the word toxin is mentioned, the red flag should be going up. That's like a, badge of bullshit.
Yeah, that's important to get on the table. I'm glad you said it. Okay, so I thought that one of the cool things that maybe we could talk about before we have to tie things up is a conversation that you and I were having before we started rolling about sort of what you were calling meta-science, which it's funny because I I talk about, and I hear a lot about metacognition, which is thinking about thinking.
Yeah.
But I don't know if I had ever heard the term meta-science, which is kind of like the science of science.
Yeah, so meta-science is sort of the science of how science is done and science of studies. And it's an area that's getting a lot more attention in recent years. You may have heard of this reproducibility crisis that some fields of science are
Yay,
having.
psychology.
Yeah, and psychology has really been, I don't know if you want to call it a leader, but an example here.
Well, especially with all those fMRI studies.
Yeah.
And there's a lot.
Yeah.
There's a lot.
But I will say one thing that psychology has been doing is addressing the issues. And, it was pretty controversial for a while. And I am sure that it still is in some quarters. The thing that you have to understand is that people who have become, top of their field as it is practiced in a particular way are going to resist change, any kind of change to that process that got them to where they are. Which makes it interesting that, a lot of these movements are being led by graduate students and postdocs and early career scientists. But there's really a push in psychology to make the field more rigorous, to do things that will make it more reproducible. But what's really exciting now is that this is starting to carry over to sports science. And as I was researching this book, I just got so frustrated because of looking at these studies. And I had been writing so much for 538 and elsewhere about these problems in psychology and all of the issues around this. With p-hacking, it's something I've written a lot about. Some of the study design issues. Small sample sizes are really problematic. It makes it very hard to get reliable results when you have really small studies. Well, in sports science, I'm regularly seeing sample sizes of 10 or 12, which is just sort of outlandish.
I feel like that's a good end for a qualitative study, not a quantitative study. Yeah, you can get some depth of outcomes in a study like that if you're really going to dive deep into how the people felt and what their experience was like but that's like a quantitative study that you could do in like a day too. Yeah. That's the frustrating part. Not only is it not kind of compelling, it's also kind of low-hanging fruit.
It is, but I'll just say that in sports science, it's not going to be an easy problem to tackle because it's not easy to do large-scale studies. It's really hard in sports science to do studies that have 100 or 200 people, which is what you need if you want to have more reliable results. It's
hard to do that with people anyway.
Yeah.
And to make sure that you have, representative groups that you're comparing that have similar features and traits, and did they eat exactly the same food, and did they do the exact same exercise? And it's just the more you work with people, the more you introduce confounds. It's one thing with cloned mice.
Right. And so, but, looking at this field, I just saw again and again. So this is something that I've really noticed having written and reported about meta-science in different types of science too. This is a problem the reproducibility issue is a problem that's being found in many different areas of science, not just one. Psychology is sort of one that's been talked about a lot, but this is something that's been found in clinical medicine and oncology, other places. But one thing that's really interesting is that each field of research sort of has their own culture and their own sort of accepted practices. And so in sports science, it's very accepted to have small sample sizes. And I think in part that's because it's really hard to do it differently. It's not, I want to be really clear here. Sports scientists are good scientists. It's not that they're terrible and they don't know what they're doing. It's that they're tackling a really hard problem. The issue, though, is that they're doing it in a way that's sort of almost, you have to wonder if it's a waste of resources sometimes to do studies that are turning up, results that may not be reproducible, that may be misleading.
You need to have a different bar when your sample size is that small. And sometimes that bar is so difficult that you're never going to have positive results. That's where things get really, really difficult.
Yeah. And I actually wrote at 538 about there were some people in the field who actually literally invented, I don't mean that in a nice way, this new statistics to try and tackle part of this problem. And they basically came up with this new way of analyzing results that allows them to basically results in many more positives. Of course, most of them are false positives. Yeah. And so that was sort of the wrong way to go about the problem. But I think that they had identified the problem, that it's hard. It's hard. It was just sort of the wrong solution. But so it's really exciting to see now there's a new group that's formed. It's called STORC, which is an acronym. It stands for Society for Transparency, Openness, and Replication in Kinesiology. And so kinesiology is another term that's often used for exercise science. And this is a group that's being led primarily by earlier career scientists that are really using the psychology model. So there's been a lot of work done in psychology. There's an association that started there to really push for better methodology. And so now that's beginning to be a thing in sports science. So that's really interesting and exciting to me. I'm going to be really curious to see where it goes, what it results in, and whether they're able to succeed in bringing a little bit more rigor to the field. And again, I want to just say that I'm not saying that it's a field that isn't rigorous, but just that there are a lot of things that could be done to make it more reliable.
Yeah, we've been talking about that a little bit lately on the other podcast I work on, Skeptic's Guide, and what are some of these changes that we could see in these fields? And things from everything from ensuring some journals have even banned the P statistic altogether. They've banned the alpha cutoff there, and sometimes it's like only an effect size or a Bayesian kind of explanation of your results, but also. Whether you're using these different cutoffs or not, I think sometimes the fundamental problem is, as you said, like inadvertent p-hacking. Yeah. It's this idea that being a sophisticated statistician is a career in itself.
It is.
And so one of the things that we talk about a lot on the Skeptic's Guide is how cool would it be if it became a regular thing that one of your co-authors should always be a statistician. If you're going to publish on a quantitative, investigation, have a statistician be a part of the team that's doing the investigation.
And not just someone you're sending your results to get p-values. That person should be involved in the planning.
Yeah.
You should make sure that you are recruiting that you're going to have the power you need to find
you can't do that post-hoc.
No.
You have to do that beforehand.
But this stuff is tricky stuff, and it's things that people aren't normally, right now, status quo is that people aren't given a lot of deep training on this, and people tend to be a little bit averse to getting into the numbers and statistics, and I think that that's a problem. Hopefully it's something that will change. We'll see.
I hope so.
They really need to do. But, talking about p-values, I don't think that necessarily getting rid of p-values is the answer, because the problem isn't the p-value. The problem is the way that p-values are used. And the problem is that we have this tendency to want, what we really want is a statistic that will tell us, is this true or is this correct? And there is no such thing. There just isn't. There's not going to be one. And as long as we are so you can get rid of p-values, but if you institute something else without sort of changing the way that we're thinking about results and thinking about the way we do analysis, you're really not going to get rid of the problem.
No, it's just a new stand-in.
Yeah. I mean, and you really have to avoid having these thresholds where it's okay, under this number or above this, it's either true or false. Those sorts of dichotomies just don't exist in nature.
I know, but we all wish that it did.
Yeah.
According to my study, I am 100% correct.
Right, yeah.
And that's where you see sometimes problems with science communication, science journalism, and sort of the way that these things get interpreted and translated along the way. We are reasonably confident that under these specific circumstances, there's a good chance that this occurs, turns into we have proven this. And
right.
It's no,
totally.
we don't like that word. All right, well,
exactly.
I would feel really horrible if I made you late for your own book talk. So
thank you.
We're about to run, but I do want to close asking you the same final two questions that I close asking everybody who's on the show, because the listeners get pissed when I forget to. So, and they're big picture questions.
Okay.
And it's cool because we've been talking about a very specific conversation, but I know that as somebody with your background and your interest area or your broad interest, that you're going to have a different answer to this question. It's probably not going to have to do with sports. I could be wrong. So when you think about the future, in whatever context is relevant to you right now, because I know that there's a lot of transition in your life. You've left 538. You are now doing the full-time freelance thing, and you're juggling so many different things and writing all of the time and doing all these appearances. So in your life, and you also have a personal life, you are not just your work.
Right.
Or something kind of grander, broader, global concerns, ethics, all these big things. Number one, what is the thing that really keeps you up the most at night? What is the thing that you're like, ugh, not looking good, not feeling 100%
global
optimistic?
Warming. I mean, hands down, right? Like, is there another answer? I don't know.
So that's the big thing for you. Is like really this climate change thing. It's like I'm not hopeful about this.
Not hopeful. I mean, I would like to be hopeful,
but it's tough, right?
Yeah.
That's one of those things where it's getting harder and harder to see the silver lining. Okay, then on the flip side of that, what is the thing that you actually? And it's not lip service, and it's not some sort of like affirmation that you're kind of just saying to say it, but you genuinely are kind of hopeful and optimistic about.
Wow, that's a much harder question. That's not good, is it?
Shows you that you and I are similar thinkers.
I know. I don't know. I feel like as I've gotten older, I've sort of come to think less optimistically about the world, although maybe becoming a little more accepting of it. No, I'm still optimistic about a lot of things. I think that, I don't know. I feel like it's dumb to feel this way, but I do have a bit of optimism that things are going to get better for women in science and in careers, and
well,
not
they
just,
already are,
not just
right?
women. Yeah, exactly. But I also sort of feel like I thought that when I was 20, and I thought things were really changing. And now that I'm over 40, and I look at the changes I've seen, and they're minuscule compared to what I was expecting. And in many cases, it feels like we've gone backwards. And so. Yeah, I don't. Maybe I'm hopeful about that. Maybe I'm not.
Hopeful with a caveat.
Yeah.
No, it's true. And sometimes I think the problem is that it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, or maybe I should say 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, because I do think it is moving. But sometimes you regress when you have certain administrations and you have certain people who have a lot of influence. But also sometimes stuff has to blow up before it can be put back together. And so I think big, demonstrable, dirty, getting into the weeds and understanding what's happening in, the hashtag Me Too, as much as it's a hashtag, it represents something disgusting that a lot of people didn't want to admit.
Yeah.
And I would see that people, I'd have male friends to say, can you believe this is all happening? Oh my gosh. I'm like, you realize it's always been happening. You just know about it now. Like that's the difference.
Right.
But we have to know about it in order to do anything about it.
Yeah, and this makes me realize actually there is something that I am hopeful about. And that is, I guess I'm sort of hopeful. This is going to sound so like grandiose, but I do take hope, and I sort of feel good about sort of the human spirit and creativity. And let me tell you a little bit what I mean by that. I sort of feel like in some ways, like maybe science won't save us, but art can. And
love
artistic expressions. And sometimes it feels like, when the world's going to shit, art is sort of the thing that can help us out and get us through that. And I just have a new podcast that's out. It's called Emerging Form. My co-host is a poet, and we talk about the creative process.
Oh,
and it's been so interesting hearing from listeners about their own creative struggles. But what I've been finding is that there are so many people that are doing, whatever they're doing in their lives and pursuing so many different careers, but that are pursuing creative, whether it's art, literature, but some sort of creative process and creative thing. And I think that has really been a source of hope for so many people. And I know I feel that way for myself. The things when everything is feeling sort of hopeless, art and sort of making something really can give you something positive to feel.
Absolutely. And even for I think the improvements that we're seeing in science.
Yes.
It's the creative endeavors that are making those biggest improvements.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that creativity is really something that is important for all fields, whether you recognize it or not. I mean, even programming requires creativity.
For sure. And diversity, people. Diversity.
Yes. Diversity, absolutely. Yeah.
So the book is good to go. What the athlete in all of us can learn from the strange science of recovery. Christie Aschwanden, tell us how we can find out all about everything you're up to. How do people find you on social media? How do they follow your work?
So my Twitter handle and also Instagram is Cragcrest. It's CRAGCREST. It's a place name, so it's like crag, like craggy rock. Crest. It's my favorite trail run.
Love it.
Where I live. My website is ChristieAschwanden.com. If you want to find out more about the book, www.goodtogobook.com. And then the podcast is emergingform.com. And
Awesome.
You can find it on iTunes and all of that too.
Great. So guys, run out and do that. Thank you, Christie, so much. This was such a great chat.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's a lot of fun. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.